your weekly guide to the world of sex education. Join Roma every Tuesday night from 8 to 9 p.m. exclusively on Zolized Radio 96.1 FM. It's the perfect way to spice up your midweek routine and get answers to all your burning questions. Whether you're looking for relationship advice or curious about the art of intimacy, Roma's got you covered. Pleasure Pulse, every Tuesday night from 8 to 9 p.m. only on Zolized Radio 96.1 FM. Don't miss out. Your sex education journey starts this Tuesday with Roma as your guide.
Everyone, welcome to another episode of Pleasure Pulse. I'm your host, Roma Richardson, and I'm so happy to have you here with me for another Tuesday night, another conversation on sex and something. You're tuned into ZIZ on 96.1, and you should also be able to find us online on YouTube and I believe on Facebook. But before we get deep into our topic tonight, we're going to take a short break just so you can let everybody know that Pleasure Pulse is live, and then we will come back and get into tonight's conversation. Stay tuned. Back to Pleasure Pulse. I'm your host, Roma Richardson, and you're tuned into ZIZ Radio 96.1, ZIZ on YouTube, ZIZ online, and I believe we might also be on Facebook, but you can also definitely listen to us on ZIZ's website through the Listen Radio Live option. It's a pleasure to be with you tonight for another conversation about sex and something, and tonight we're talking about sex and sexual orientations. So in previous some shows ago, I talked about sexual orientation and gender identity broadly, and I gave some examples of some sexual orientations, but I want to zero in on sexual orientation specifically. And there might be a show where I zero in on gender identity also specifically. But tonight I wanted to zero in on sexual orientation because a while ago I had a conversation with someone who identifies as asexual. And some things came up in that conversation that I just thought it was worth having a broader discussion about sexual orientation on. So there's lots to say, and I probably will not be able to say everything that there is to say about sexual orientation. But as usual, as I always do, I encourage you to do your own reading. You know, you hear something that I mention, you look it up, or if I miss something that you're curious about or that you have heard about a lot in other spaces or one time in other spaces, I encourage you, look it up, see what you find, see what you learn. We're here learning and sharing together. So don't just end it with what I said, right? Like always go, whether that is conversations with other folks or it is online research from reputable sources, credible sources, of course, because sexuality, research around sexuality, discourse around sexuality is one of those things that that is always evolving. So there's always more to learn, more to explore, and more to understand. So I definitely encourage you to look into it, to do some more research, for the conversation not to end here, wherever you fall on the sexuality or sexual orientation spectrum. So let's get into it. Now, sexual orientation describes who somebody is attracted to sexually, emotionally, and whoever that person wants to have relationships with. Or it can also describe the lack of all of this attraction or interest. It is an enduring pattern of attraction to people of the same or different genders or more than one gender or no genders at all, and it is part of a person's identity. For some people, it is a bigger part of their identity than for others, but it's definitely one of those things that shapes or can shape how we live our lives, can shape how we express and experience the world, how we express our own beliefs and ideas around whatever it is. And so it's something not to be taken for granted or diminished in terms of the importance or significance in people's lives. Now, sexual orientation is separate from gender and sex. And I believe either in that conversation when we talked about sexual orientation and gender identity or in previous shows, we've talked about the difference between gender and sex, and sexual orientation is not interchangeable with any of those things. Activity does not dictate orientation. So what people do does not tell you what they are or how they might identify. So who people have sex with, what people do in the bedroom might not be an indicator, is not always an indicator of their actual sexual orientation. Sexual orientation, and this might be a big one for some folks, something new that some folks are hearing. Sexual orientation can be fluid and change over time. And some people, in addition to, the folks who might identify particular ways, some people prefer not to have any labels ascribed to or attached to their sexual orientation or who they are attracted to. So some people prefer not to put any labels on them, whereas some people are perfectly okay identifying this way or identifying that way. Now, apart from or outside of sexual intercourse or other sexual acts, you can also express your sexual orientation in a number of ways, including holding hands, kissing, other forms of non-sexual physical interaction, where you provide emotional support to, commitment, deep bonds and similar values and life goals, all of those things. And remember, a couple of weeks ago we talked about what is sex in the first place. So understanding that there are lots of ways that people can display or show sexual attraction without having sex is important to keep in mind. Sexual orientation now, researchers are understanding more and more, I think, have agreed at this point, but that sexual orientation exists on more of a continuum. So before we used to think of it as is either this or is that, and there was nothing in between. But now we understand that sexual orientation is a long continuum, a long space with lots of things in between, with things beyond ends that we thought about before, and it's not binary. It's not this or this, but it is lots of orientations that people can be. And as I mentioned, it is also fluid and can change over time. So people don't have to commit to an orientation for their entire lives. Life experiences, exposure to different folks, different types of relationships can all shape how we view ourselves and how our identities and our sexual orientations are expressed and built. So, in general, and I'm going to then break down these broader categories, we're talking about allosexual, which is an umbrella term for people who regularly experience sexual attraction to others. And then there's asexual, so people who do not experience sexual attraction to others or experience limited or conditional attraction. They may experience romantic or other types of attraction, as well as they might not. So you could be asexual and aromantic, and that means that you don't experience sexual attraction to others nor romantic attraction to others. Or you could be asexual and romantic, so you could not experience sexual attraction to others but experience romantic attraction to others. And let me pause here and put a reminder for, doing some reading and research on your own, because there are a lot of terms. There are a lot of terms to know, and not complicated at all. I would say as complex as the human experience, the human body, the human being, and human relationships, but things that can definitely be understood and learned with time spent. So examples of some sexual orientations are heterosexual or straight, gay, lesbian, bisexual, pansexual. I mentioned asexual, and there are many others, and I'm going to get into some of them. So first one, not because we at the top of the list or anything, right? We're kind of going through the continuum from allosexual to asexual. So heterosexual refers to the sexual orientation of an individual who is attracted to people of a different gender than their own. So people will often talk about heterosexuals being a man attracted to a woman attracted to a man. That's typically how people talk about heterosexuals. But heterosexuals can be any person of one gender who is attracted to another person of a different gender. People also talk about opposite genders and opposite sex. But when we understand that gender and sex also exists on a spectrum, on a continuum, then we realize there's no opposite, really. So I prefer to talk about people attracted to people of a different gender than of an opposite gender. And of course, we have heterosexual, and I said, it could be heterosexual men, heterosexual women, whatever it is. We also have gay. Gay is an adjective that refers to folks with attractions to people of the same gender. And the term gay is typically associated with men. So you'd have gay men, and then we talk about lesbians. And lesbians is the term for women, typically, who are attracted to other women. And there is a lot of variation in that attraction. There are lesbians who are only attracted or exclusively attracted to other women. There are also lesbians who describe themselves as being mainly or primarily attracted to women. Some lesbian women, some women who are attracted to other women prefer to describe themselves as gay women instead of lesbians. So also, a major note in the language is we can determine people's sexual orientation for them. People have to identify for themselves, which is also important, not just because there are folks who don't want to use any of the labels that exist, but because we should allow people to identify however they want. I think a couple shows ago I also talked about spending time determining who is what, and that being a waste of time because of a number of reasons. One being, of course, connected to people's humanity, respect, what it means for us to identify people one way versus another. But it's important for us to allow people to identify how they identify, and not for us to tell people that they're confused or they're going through a phase, which is what I'm sure lots of people here, especially folks who don't abide by our traditional expectations and rules and norms in terms of sexuality, sexual orientation, who you should have sex with, how you should have that sex, and so on. Now, bisexual, which we shorten to bi oftentimes, is a sexual orientation that refers to attraction to multiple genders, and that attraction, of course, can be sexual, romantic, emotional, and it is oftentimes limited to what folks will call the gender binary, which is man or woman, but it is misunderstood in that way. So a bisexual person is not necessarily someone who is attracted to men and women, but it is somebody who is attracted to multiple genders. So any of the other genders, once it is multiple genders, can describe a bisexual person. So it doesn't have a single universal definition in terms of who can identify as bisexual. So it could be attraction to women and men. It could be attraction to women and people of another gender identity. It could be attraction to two genders. And it could be a variety of things, right? But I think the important thing to understand too, especially when it comes to bisexuality, just as I mentioned earlier, in terms of assuming that people are claiming that people are trying to convince people that it's a phase, or that they're confused, or they have to choose a side, or they can be greedy, or whatever, it's for us to understand that sexuality means a lot of different things to a lot of different people, and there are people who are a lot more open, curious about their sexuality, and I feel like that is a trait that more of us can take on, because part of it is our discomfort with the idea that people can be so open, so explorative, so committed to living whatever they see as a full life, in comparison to maybe our feelings that we have to accommodate these very strict and rigid rules around sex that exist for all of us. So I think it's important that we allow all people, especially bisexual people, because bisexual people, I think, oftentimes experience a unique set of challenges, especially surrounding the accusations of confusion, of picking a side, or whatever it is. I think people also assume that folks are going to be bisexual for a while and then are going to settle down with somebody of a different gender, or that, the relationships are not equally as valuable to them, and people can be more attracted to some genders than other genders, of course, but that decision or decisions around it shouldn't be determined by our expectations of people. Okay? And then there's also pansexual, which people shorten to pan sometimes, and that is about attraction to multiple genders, and it's often also described as attraction to all genders and attraction to anybody. So I think a major part of pan identities is that there is a lot more openness. It's about attraction in general. So you might meet somebody and it don't have nothing to do with their gender, it don't have anything to do with their sex, but it has to do with your connection to that person. So once those souls connect, that is what the attraction is based on. And some, of course, persons who identify as pansexual could consider gender as a factor in the way that they are attracted, and some are attracted to different genders in different ways, more attracted to particular genders than to others. And it's part of the bisexual umbrella. So that refers to, as I mentioned, anybody who is attracted to more than one gender. Now, in my research, and remember I said we're all learning here, I discovered polysexual. Not discovered like Christopher Columbus, but discovered like was introduced to the new term. So polysexuality is sexual attraction to various but not necessarily all genders. So a polysexual person may experience attraction to any number of genders, going between at least two and many, versus pansexual, who we said, is typically attraction to all genders, and people oftentimes, irrespective of gender. Polysexual people might have a preference when it comes to which gender they're attracted to, but this is not necessarily the case. And then, we ain't finished it. As I mentioned, there's a lot, it's a spectrum. And, you'll see that some of these are umbrella terms, so it's not necessarily this on its own, but this describes this type of attraction in general, whether it is to one person or to more than one person. So you'll find that some terms are more umbrella terms. But abrosexual or abrosexual individuals are those whose sexual orientation is more fluid or changes over time. So remember earlier I said at the start of the show that sexual orientation can be fluid, can change over time for many people. Abrosexual is the term to describe that fluidity and that changing over time. So abrosexuality involves your entire orientation changing over time, and the intensity of the attractions might change as well. And of course, there's no set schedule, so nothing to say that it has to change over this period or that period. It could be changes from as short as an hour to as long as years for orientations to change. And some abrosexual individuals can sometimes be asexual. So abrosexuality could also be considered as part of the asexual spectrum. It could also be part of the multisexual spectrum, or bisexual or polysexual spectrum. So, some more notes about fluidity, because I think it's important to pause here to talk a little bit more about that, especially in response to, I think, certain claims and certain ideas about sexual orientation being fixed, and understanding that sexual orientation is an intrinsic part of ourselves, understanding that sexual orientation isn't something that I think sometimes we think about sexual orientation as flighty, right? There's one side where we think about it as very flighty, and there's one side where we think about it as so rigid, so fixed, that if people express an attraction, an interest, if people enter into relationships with people of genders that they hadn't been in relationships with, that we think that they were always that way before. So I think there is that extreme, or there are those extremes where we think it's very flighty and very very easily influence and change, and there's that part where we think that whatever we see people as now is what they have always been. So it doesn't really allow for that evolution and that understanding that sexuality is really a spectrum and does really exist on a continuum. So people will sometimes interpret understand fluidity as confusion, or sometimes as betrayal of an allegiance to a specific community. So for example, I remember some episodes of this TV show I was watching, and the conversations were around it was a lesbian couple, and one of them was very afraid to enter into another committed relationship with a woman because the previous relationship, or one of the previous relationships she'd had with a woman, ended with the woman telling her that she was going back to men, right? So there are, I think, ways that we can definitely take advantage of and be having fun when the other person isn't really having fun at all. The other person is looking for and is thinking that they are on the road to something more serious, whereas, you know, somebody might be exploring or be more curious or whatever it is, right? And so I think there's a deep sense of hurt that can come from situations like that, or from situations where, you know, somebody maybe was primarily dating women for 25 years of their lives, and then in the last 5 years decided to settle down with a man, right? So and it could also work the same for heterosexual people. So that betrayal of what feels like that community connection, especially if it is a marginalized community, can sometimes exist. And of course, when people have normal feelings about love and sex and curiosity, those oftentimes get dismissed when it comes to conversations and stigma around same gender attraction and consequences for that kind of betrayal. Now, many people only ever feel attracted to one gender, but people of any gender can be sexually fluid. Some research that I've accessed suggests that women tend to be more fluid, or tend to experience more fluidity than men, but it doesn't, of course, mean that all women are sexually fluid. I think some people would like that because it would serve some people's agenda. But it's important for us to understand that even, like, irrespective of what gender you are, sexual fluidity is something that any human can experience. There might also be a lot of men who are more sexually fluid, whose identities, attractions are more fluid. Their activity might not be more fluid, and they might feel stilted or stunted in terms of their ability to talk about, ability to explore that range of attraction. I think this is especially true of men versus women. You know, women are oftentimes more able to explore same gender attraction if that is what they're interested in, or other attraction to multiple other genders other than men. But men are not often given that space and that level of support and openness to explore. And that, of course, is because of gender stereotypes, sexual stereotypes, who we expect men to have sex with, who we expect men to be attracted to. Queer is an identifier for people who are not exclusively heterosexual, who use it in reference to their gender identity or gender expression, or who are fluid in their identities. And queer is also an umbrella term that could refer to multiple different experiences, orientations, and identities. Let's put a pause here. I've talked about a lot. Let me just run you through all of the identities, all of the orientations that I've mentioned, just in case you want to look anything up. And then when we come back, we'll continue talking. So I've talked about heterosexual or straight people, gay, lesbian, bisexual, pansexual, polysexual, abrosexual, and queer. When we come back, we'll keep talking about sexual orientation. Stay tuned. Back to Pleasure Pulse. We've been talking about sexual orientations, and I've been running through the list of some that exist. Not an exhaustive list, so I'll always encourage you to, research. Not only if you are a person who is unsure about what your sexual orientation is. But I think this is important for all of us to know and to understand, because whatever line of work you're in, I think we make assumptions about people's sexual orientations, their sexual practices, their sexual partners, their sexual history, their sexual status, all of these things. And they are oftentimes connected to what we assume to be people's sexual orientation. That could be their default sexual orientation. We assume by default that everybody is heterosexual, and then to identify people who are not heterosexual, we tap into stereotypes. So how we think people who are heterosexual or not heterosexual will act, and so on. And we use those assumptions to make decisions, whether they are policy decisions, whether they are program decisions. And these decisions based on false information, false realities, can really affect how people experience, use services, and can also affect people's life outcomes. And they do affect people's life outcomes. And I think, when we're talking about things like sexual orientations, just like when we're talking about gender identity, just like when we're talking about any other aspect of sex education, having the language can often empower people to understand their experience and then to talk about their experience, or at the very least, to understand that experience and understanding your own experiencing, understanding that there's a word for what you feel, there's language for what you've experienced and what it is you're going through for whichever part you are in life right now, can be really powerful in showing that, you know, you're experiencing an individual experience, right? That it is not something that only you alone in the world has ever gone through. And at least for me, like, I feel so empowered, so much better often when I'm able to find that there are words to describe something that I'm feeling, an emotion, a feeling, some kind of attraction, whatever it is. Like when I discovered the word queer platonic, I didn't discover it again, not like Christopher Columbus, when I learned of the word queer platonic, which means a deep emotional attraction, bond, closeness with friends. It is deeper than a typical like friendship, whatever. It is, I think, connected to those relationships among friends where they decide to live with each other and do life together, but there's no sexual attraction, there's no romantic attraction. We're interested in having sex with each other, we're in love with each other, but we love each other, right? And we want to share life, experience life with each other. I was very happy when I learned that word because it, to me, very much described my feelings towards some of my friends and my hopes and dreams for some of my friendships. Anyways, I digress. Back to what we're talking about, which is finally the asexuality spectrum. An asexual person, I think I mentioned this earlier, does not experience sexual attraction or desire, or experiences it in limited ways or conditional ways. And I think this is also one of the orientations that gets a lot of questions and is oftentimes invalidated, and people who are asexual often feel like they don't have a right to exist as asexual because people also assume that everybody experiences sexual and also romantic attraction, and that's just not true. And it's not necessarily about, it's not time specific. It's not, that if somebody is celibate, then they are asexual or anything like that, because celibate people can break their celibacy, can have sex, can experience sexual attraction even if they're not having sex, right? So asexuality is that enduring non-sexual attraction to others, or limited sexual attraction, or conditional sexual attraction. And it's not a personal choice. Just like being gay, being heterosexual is not a personal choice. And it's not something that has to be fixed. It's not something that we should try to fix, especially not with sex. So asexuality is also an umbrella term, and there are variations under that term. There's demisexual, and that is people who only experience sexual attraction after forming a strong emotional bond or connection. There's gray sexual, people who experience sexual attraction rarely or very weakly, as in not strongly or only under specific conditions. And there are people who are aromantic. So there can also be people who are asexual who are aromantic, as I mentioned. So asexual people who also do not experience romantic attraction. This is definitely something you can read up on, because Yeah, we got a few more minutes. We might not have enough time, even though I said this was the impetus for this conversation. So asexuality is just about sexual orientation. It's not about romantic, aesthetic, or sensual attraction. And you have asexual people who still are interested in romantic relationships, who can still fall in love, who can still find people that they enjoy, whose lives they want to share in, and all of those things. And there's also much difference, variety in terms of the attitude towards sex. Some people are indifferent towards sex. Some people might engage in it for a partner's benefit or for physical pleasure, even without sexual attraction, or in those specific conditions I mentioned can exist, or at those times where that attraction, might be stronger, as strong as it can get, than other times. Or it can be, of course, after that strong emotional bond is formed. So, yeah, I think asexuality, deserves its own deep dive and its own look into it. And I am definitely open to asexual people who would love to come on the show or who want to talk to me outside of the show so that I can reflect some of that conversation here. But I think it's important to understand that and to underscore that it's not a choice, it's not a condition, it's a spectrum, and it refers to a lot of identities that exist under it. So all asexual people are not the same, just like all heterosexual people are not the same, all bisexual people are not the same. And it would be good for us to approach sexual orientation and sexuality from that understanding and that perspective, because when we look at sexual orientation, when we look at sex more expansively, we can appreciate, I think, more deeply, more honestly, the vastness of the human experience. I think we often, and there's, of course, nothing wrong with you like somebody of a different gender and that's all you're like, that's cool. Like, I think we also don't want to vanilla shame. I don't know a better word for it. We don't want to shame people for liking what they like. Like, for example, people talk about vanilla, and that's why I said vanilla sex being missionary sex, but missionary sex is good sex. Like, whatever sex for you is good sex, right? So I think we also have to be careful about not shaming people who like just what they like. Of course, you shouldn't shame people for liking what they like either, right? We should all respect people's choices in terms of the activity that they choose to have, but we should also respect the orientations that they identify as. And so that also means that if somebody tells us they are a particular orientation and they don't have any sex at all, that we're like, okay, cool, we believe, because being any orientation, any of these orientations does not mean that you have to have sex to prove that you are that orientation. It doesn't mean that you have to participate in a particular activity to prove that you're that orientation, whatever that orientation is. There's no true anything. And so when we are having conversations with our partners, with ourselves, with our children, with our peers about sexual orientation, key to state and key for folks to understand, for all of us to understand, is that it exists on a spectrum. It is not the same anywhere you go, it is not the same with anybody you talk to. As I mentioned, people's orientation can change over time. For some people, sexuality is a lot more fluid than for others. And that's just what it is. I wish for a space where people feel safe and comfortable and can enthusiastically, consensually tap into all of the things that they want to try. And I also wish for a space where trying, exploration are encouraged, are celebrated, are allowed, where we're not pigeonholing people into this identity or that identity, whether that identity is a heterosexual or a homosexual identity, because I think that it also exists across communities. I wish for a space where we're not trying to convert people from whatever sexual orientation they have identified as, because there's no scientific or academic evidence to show that those conversion therapies, conversion attempts work, right? We should allow people, support people in being who they are, and we should also provide them with the education and the language so they can be informed, so they can use that information for knowledge about what they can do, what they want to do, how they want to live their lives, and all of those things. Because I think that we do each other a disservice in not being honest about the range of possibilities that exist. And like I mentioned, not having the language for it just means that you aren't able to use those specific words. It might mean that you didn't realize that it was a thing. And so having the language, it doesn't mean that the thing doesn't happen. It just means that maybe you thought it was a singular experience. And so knowing the language, knowing the terms, knowing that there's research on the experience, knowing that for some groups of people, they've interviewed hundreds of people and people have identified this way, or have said this was an experience of theirs, or whatever it is. I think all of that can help to strengthen people's own identities and can help us to be a lot more proud, a lot more confident in whoever it is we are. And still, it's important for us to create environments where people can do that. So not for I've been having, some conversations with some folks recently about the level of homophobia in Caribbean countries, in St. Kitts as one example. And I think the expression of homophobia is very interesting here, very different to other places, manifests, I think, a lot more, or oftentimes more, subtly and quietly, but it's not because it doesn't exist, right? I think because it's not overt or it's not loud, we can assume that it doesn't exist, but it's definitely here. And it's not something that will disappear on its own. It's something that we have to actively work towards. And I think that if we create a space where people of all sexual orientations, we understand sexual orientation as what it is, a continuum, with people falling at various points in that continuum, and that continuum, being explored by people over time, over their lives, then we can have a better, safer society where everybody feels comfortable to live. So including ace people. I bring that back because I said that's where the whole conversation came. So we all can benefit from spaces that feel safer, and we all can contribute to making those spaces feel safer, making those spaces non-violent, making those spaces love-filled for everybody. Anyways, I will encourage you, as I mentioned a few times, to look up sexual orientations, see what you find, see what others you find, because others exist. See what else you find on the spectrum. I would just encourage you to do that and report back. So when you see me on the road, tell me what you learn. I'd love to hear. I'd love to hear some of those things. You could teach me something too. Anyways, I'm going to leave you all here. It was a pleasure to be here as usual. I'm going to see you all next week and wish you a pleasurable evening.